Good evening, and welcome back. If you are just joining us for the first time, I am glad you found your way here. And if you have been with us before, then you already know what kind of night this is going to be. Settle in. Pull whatever warmth you have close to you. A blanket, a lamp left low, the ambient hiss of something outside your window. Tell me in the comments where you are listening from tonight, whether it is a city or a hillside or somewhere in between, because I always want to know, and because geography matters more than people tend to think when we are talking about fire. Tonight, we're going back a very long time. We are going to a plateau, dry and wind-scoured and enormous, that stretches across what is now Iran and parts of Central Asia and fragments of Turkey and down toward the Persian Gulf. We are going to the world that the Greeks called Persia and the Persians called something far older, something closer to the word Iran itself, Ariana Vaeja, the expanse of the Aryan lands, a place not of conquest initially, but of pasture and sky and seasonal migration, of people who moved with their herds and built their cosmologies out of the same materials they had available. Fire and wind and the long cold of winter and the almost violent relief of spring. We are going to the world of the Magi. You have heard that word. Everyone has heard that word in one context or another. The three wise men who followed a star, who appear in one gospel and vanish from history without leaving a name or a destination. But the Magi were not a story. They were a caste, a lineage, a specialized priestly order that predated Zoroastrianism as we formally identify it, that outlasted the Achaemenid Empire, that survived Alexander, that bent and reformed through the Parthians and the Sassanids, that sent tremors into early Christianity and left fingerprints on Mithraism and Manichaeanism and medieval alchemy and the whole Western tradition of ceremonial magic all the way down to the word itself. Magic, which is just the word magi with a suffix attached, which is to say the word that means the impossible, is just the word that means these particular priests, laundered through Greek and Latin until the original referent was forgotten. What they actually did is what we are here to talk about. What they believed about fire. Not fire as metaphor, not fire as symbol in the lazy sense, but fire as a living entity, as a deity's body made physical, as a substance that existed in a state between matter and spirit, and that required tending the way you tend a relationship, with attention and ritual and the understanding that neglect has consequences. That is what we are going to walk through tonight. All of it, the cosmology it emerged from, the wars between gods and demons that made fire necessary, the priests who kept it, the heroes who handled it, the great ceremonies that once, and this is not metaphor either, burned continuously for centuries without being permitted to go out. I should warn you that this is a long story, but that is fine. That is why you are here. In the beginning, there was light, and there was its opposite. This is almost too simple to say and almost impossible to mean correctly, because the dualism at the heart of ancient Iranian cosmology has been simplified and caricatured so many times that the original idea has been worn nearly smooth. But let us try to restore some texture to it. The great theologian of early Zoroastrianism, if theologian is even the right word, prophet might be closer, or visionary, or reformer, was a man named Zarathustra, whom the Greeks called Zoroaster, and whom tradition places somewhere between 1500 and 1000 BCE. Those scholars argue about this with a particular kind of ferocity that suggests the date actually matters to people's careers. What he articulated or what he received in a series of visions by the river Daitya, or what he reconstructed from older sources, was a cosmology in which existence had been structured from its very first moment by a fundamental binary, not good and evil in the way we lazily use those terms, something more architectural than that. There was Ahura Mazda, the wise lord, and there was Angra Mainyu, the destructive spirit. Some accounts say they were twin emanations of a more primordial entity called Zurvan, time itself, which would mean that both the creator and the destroyer were children of the same endless parent, a detail that Zoroastrian orthodoxy would later suppress because it was uncomfortable, and because orthodoxy is always most uncomfortable with the things that were once believed. In the cleaner formulation, the one that became canonical, Ahura Mazda existed from the beginning in a realm of light. Angra Mainyu existed in a realm of darkness, and the universe as we experience it, this mixed, complicated, frustrating place, was the result of their collision. Ahura Mazda created first. He created in a sequence that the Zoroastrian texts describe with careful specificity: sky, water, earth, plants, animals, humans. Each creation was perfect, luminous, uncontaminated, and each creation was followed, after a period that the texts describe variously as 3,000 years and as an instant, by Angra Mainyu's assault on it. The sky was cracked, the water was salted and made bitter, the earth was pocked and scarred, plants were afflicted with death. The primal bull, that first sacred archetypal animal, was poisoned and killed, and the first human, Gaiomard, the shining one, was struck down and killed as well, though from his body came the metals, and from his seed came the first human pair who grew up as a plant from the soil, intertwined, and eventually separated, and became man and woman and everything that followed. This is the wound that the universe has been healing ever since. What is important, what the later ritual system builds directly on, is the status of fire in this cosmology. Fire was not created as an afterthought. Fire was present at the very beginning, embedded in the structure of Ahura Mazda's first act of creation. The sacred texts describe Atash, the divine fire, as one of Ahura Mazda's greatest creations, a Yazata, a being worthy of worship, a divine helper, one of the entities that assist the wise lord in maintaining the world against the assault of chaos. Atash was fire, not as a physical phenomenon first, but as a cosmic principle, a divine intelligence embodied in flame, a guardian whose existence was simultaneously material and metaphysical. There were grades of fire. This is not a minor theological detail. This is the entire structure on which the later ritual system rests, so let me be precise about it. The texts describe 5 sacred fires, the Panj Adur, each with its own name and its own domain and its own level of purity and its own specific relationship to the divine order. Etar Beresnusava, burned among the gods, and the Amesha Spentas, the holy immortals, who were Ahura Mazda's closest divine associates. Atar Vahufriana, burned in the human body. This is the fire of consciousness, the fire of life, the warmth that leaves when breath leaves. Atar Urvaziashta, burned in plants and trees, concentrated in wood, latent and waiting to be released. Vaeja was lightning, the fire of the sky, the fire that bridges heaven and earth in a single violent instant. And Atash burned in the earth, the volcanic fire, the geothermal fire, the fire that proves the world itself is alive. Human fire, the fire we light, the fire we tend, was understood to be a confluence of all of these. When you struck flint to tinder in the ancient Iranian world, you were not merely creating a chemical reaction. You were summoning a sacred entity. You were calling divine fire down into the material plane and housing it, however briefly, in your hearth. This is why the ritual treatment of fire was never merely ceremonial. It was ontological. It was a response to what fire actually was. Angra Mainyu naturally hated fire. The texts describe his assault on Atash with the same intensity as his assault on all other aspects of creation. He sent his servants, the Daivas, the false gods, the demonic entities that in pre-Zoroastrian Iranian religion had actually been worshipped, which is one of the theological innovations that Zarathustra introduced, the reclassification of a whole category of divine beings as enemies, to contaminate fire, to corrupt it, to make it unpure. The battle between Atash and the demonic forces is described in the Avesta, the Zoroastrian scriptural corpus, with vivid physicality. There is a particular passage in which a demon named Zahhak, the serpent-shouldered tyrant, attempts to seize the divine fire and is repulsed. But fate had not yet spoken its last word about Zahhak or about fire, and both would appear again before this story was done. The creation was beautiful, and it was broken almost immediately. This is important to sit with for a moment, because the cosmology does not describe a fall from perfection in the distant past, followed by a long, slow recovery. It describes an ongoing state of emergency. The world is wounded now. The world is contested now. Every day is a battle, and the human role in this, and this is what makes Zoroastrianism unusual among ancient religious systems, is not merely to worship or to placate or to make offerings in hope of favorable conditions. The human role is to actively participate in the restoration of creation. Humans are not observers of the cosmic drama. They are combatants. The Amesha Spentas, the 6 great divine beings who surround Ahura Mazda, whose names translate as good mind, best truth, holy devotion, wholeness, immortality, and beneficent devotion. Each had a domain of creation assigned to their care, and each of those domains had a human counterpart, a corresponding ethical obligation. The person who cultivated the earth was not just a farmer. They were participating in the divine activity of Spenta Armaiti, holy devotion, who cared for the earth. The person who tended animals was working alongside Vohu Mana, good mind, whose creation the animals were. The person who maintained the sacred fire was performing the work of Asha Vaeja, best truth, who was, and this is the pivot, the whole ritual structure hinges on, associated with fire as a physical manifestation of cosmic order. Asha. The word translates inadequately as truth, or rightness, or cosmic order, or the principle by which things are as they should be. Its opposite was drug, the lie, the principle of wrongness, of things being out of place, of corruption and deception, and the grinding of reality against what it should be. These two, Asha and drug, are the operating principles of the cosmos in lived, daily material terms. And fire was not just associated with Asha. Fire was Asha made visible, fire burning cleanly, burning with a clear flame, not producing excess smoke, not being contaminated by impure material. This was the physical presence of truth in the world, which is why pollution of fire was not merely unhygienic. It was a theological crisis. The Magi, and we are arriving at them now, we are circling closer, were the custodians of this system. They were, most scholars believe, not originally part of the Zoroastrian reform, but a pre-existing priestly caste of Iranian-speaking peoples who were gradually absorbed into the Zoroastrian framework over the centuries, bringing their own practices and their own technical knowledge with them. They appear in Herodotus, who describes them as a tribe of the Medes, and who records various of their practices with the detached curiosity of someone who finds another culture's religion simultaneously interesting and alien. They appear in the records of the Achaemenid court, where they served as interpreters of dreams and omens. They appear in later Sassanid texts as the fully institutionalized religious hierarchy of a Persian empire that had made Zoroastrianism its state religion. But what they did, the actual physical rituals they performed, survived in fragments and in practice across an enormous span of time. And what they did, at the center of everything, was Tenfire, the yasna, the primary Zoroastrian ritual, the ceremony that appears most completely in the Surviving Avesta, is a liturgy of extraordinary complexity. It takes hours to perform correctly. It involves a trained priest, a bearsman, a bundle of twigs or metal rods representing plant life and the divine order, a haoma offering, the sacred drink pressed from a plant whose identity has been debated endlessly, and which was probably some species of ephedra, the ritual preparation of sacred water, the recitation of the Gathas in an archaic form of Avestan that had probably ceased to be a spoken language centuries before the texts were committed to writing. And it involves, throughout, a sacred fire burning on a stone altar, tended with precise care, fed with dry wood of specific types, managed with metal tongs so that human breath would not contaminate it, the ashes disposed of in designated sacred areas. The priest who performed the yasna stood before the fire not as a supplicant before a symbol. He stood as a participant in Ahura Mazda's ongoing work of keeping the world ordered. The words he spoke were not prayers in the sense of requests. They were affirmations, and more than that, they were actions. The Avestan word for this, the word that appears repeatedly in the liturgical text, is dena, which overlaps with several related concepts, but which in the context of ritual means something like the proper seeing, the alignment of perception and action with truth. When the priest performed the yasna correctly, something happened. Not just in the social or psychological sense. Something happened in the contested space between creation and destruction. This is a very old idea, and it was taken very seriously. The fire itself was prepared before the ceremony began, and its preparation was itself a ritual. Wood had to be dry. Wet wood produces smoke, and smoke was considered a pollution. Specific woods were preferred: sandalwood, white poplar, other fragrant varieties depending on regional availability. The fire had to be lit without contamination from breath or body. A cloth was held over the priest's face during tending, both to prevent this contamination and, practically, to avoid the reflexive impulse to blow on the fire to encourage it, which seems like it would help, but was considered a defilement. There is something almost, and I do not want to overstate this, but I do not want to understate it either. There is something almost obsessive about the purity regulations around Zoroastrian fire that suggests these were not invented as theological formalism, but emerged from a much older, much more visceral sense that fire was vulnerable, that it could be hurt, that you could harm it by treating it carelessly. This is not a metaphor the ancient practitioners would have needed explained. They would not have described it as a metaphor at all. The three grades of sacred temple fire are where the complexity really begins to compound. The Zoroastrian fire temples, the Atash Behrams, the victory fires, the highest and holiest category, were not simply buildings where a flame was kept burning. They were cosmological installations. The fire that burned within an Atash Behram was classified as a being of the highest sacred order, and the process of consecrating it, of creating a proper Atash Behram fire, was itself an undertaking of breathtaking ritual complexity. 16 different fires had to be gathered. Not just any fires, specific fires, each from a specific source, each representing a different domain of the world. Fire from a goldsmith's furnace, fire from a brickmaker's kiln, fire from a silversmith, fire from a soldier, fire from a shepherd who attended flocks, fire from a dyer, from a brewer, fire struck by lightning, fire kept burning by a village community. Each of these fires had to be purified through a series of ritual procedures before they could be combined. And the combining itself was a ceremony presided over by senior priests, performed with a full liturgy, completed over a period of time that some accounts suggest could take up to a year. What emerged from this process was not just a fire. It was a confluence of fires from across the entire social and natural world, purified and consecrated and brought into the presence of Ahura Mazda's truth. It was, in a very literal sense, in a cosmological understanding of those who created it, a deity resident in the material world. The Atash Behram fires were then tended continuously, not sometimes, not most days, every hour, every night, every year. The fire could not be permitted to go out, and this was not merely a rule. It was an understanding that if the fire went out, something would be lost that could not easily be restored, that the divine presence that had been gathered and concentrated through that immense ritual effort would disperse, that the sacred being that the fire was would not die exactly, but something adjacent to die, something that required the whole exhausting process to be repeated. There are 3 Atash Behrams still burning in India today, maintained by the Parsi community, the descendants of Zoroastrian refugees who fled the Islamic conquest of Persia in the 7th and 8th centuries CE. The Iran Shah, considered the most sacred, was brought to India in roughly 716 CE, though accounts of its exact history are disputed, and some traditions hold that it incorporates fire from a much earlier sacred flame, perhaps from Sassanid times, or even earlier. Whether or not that chain of continuity is historically unbroken, the symbolic weight of the claim is itself a form of evidence. It tells us what mattered to the people who maintained it, what they believed was being preserved across the centuries. The fact that it is still burning is not nothing. Below the Atash Behram in the hierarchy was the Atash Adaran, the fire of fires, a lower grade of sacred fire maintained by communities rather than by the highest priestly establishment. And below that was the Atash Dadgar, the household fire, the domestic flame that connected every Zoroastrian family to the cosmic order through the most ordinary daily act of cooking and warmth. This three-tier structure, cosmic, communal, domestic, is the structure of a complete religious system, one that did not require its adherents to journey to a temple to participate in sacred reality. Sacred reality came to them. It was in the fire they cooked with. It was in the warmth of their own bodies. It was in the lightning that occasionally terrified them. The whole world was already, always, full of fire. The ritual system was not a gateway to the sacred. It was a formalization of an encounter that was happening constantly, whether anyone noticed or not. Let me collect the thread here for a moment. We have covered an enormous amount of ground, and I want to make sure we have not lost the shape of it. We started with a cosmos divided at its foundation. We moved through the initial creation and its assault and wounding. We have been talking about fire as a cosmological entity, as a living divine presence, as something that required a specific kind of care and relationship. Now, we need to talk about the people who sustained that relationship across the centuries, their training, their daily lives, their technical knowledge, and the ways in which they became the most influential priests in the ancient world, their methods and concepts spreading far beyond the boundaries of Iran to touch virtually every subsequent religious tradition in the Western and Near Eastern world. We need to talk, in other words, about what it actually meant to be a Magos. The training took a very long time. This is the understated beginning of a story that compounds outward from there, because the Magi were not a self-appointed caste of wandering mystics, but a hereditary priestly lineage with an institutional structure, specific knowledge requirements, and a hierarchy of grades through which a practitioner advanced over years and decades. The Greek accounts, Strabo, Herodotus, Plutarch, Pliny the Elder, describe the Magi with varying degrees of accuracy and varying degrees of admiration, and they consistently note the length and difficulty of the formation required to enter the caste fully. Herodotus, who probably encountered Magi in person during his travels through the Persian Empire in the 5th century BCE, describes them as the necessary presence at all Persian sacrifices, the interpreters of royal dreams, the readers of omens. He notes that they sang theogonies, hymns to the divine order, while performing sacrifices, and that no sacrifice could be considered valid without them. This is the external view, the Greek tourist's eye view, which sees the what without necessarily understanding the why. But even from this external vantage point, the structural centrality of the Magi is clear. They were not optional. They were the machinery through which the Persian world's relationship with the sacred operated. What that machinery required from the inside was first the memorization of the Avesta. The Avesta, or rather, the portions of it that existed in whatever form they existed in during the height of the Achaemenid period, since the full surviving Avesta was not committed to writing until the Sassanid era, and much of the older material had already been lost by then, was transmitted orally. This was not an accident or a limitation. Oral transmission was considered superior to written transmission for sacred texts because it required the living body of the priest to carry the words, required breath and voice and physical memory, required the text to pass through a person, rather than simply being stored as marks on a surface. The archaic Avestan of the Gathas was already an ancient language when Zoroaster composed or received them, or the language was already archaic when the composers of the later Avesta tried to reconstruct it, and the preservation of the correct pronunciation of texts in a language no longer spoken required extraordinary pedagogical care. A young man entering Megan training, and it was men, at least in the formal priestly hierarchy, though the situation of women in Zoroastrian practice is more complex than a simple exclusion, and the domestic fire's maintenance had its own female ritual dimensions, would spend years learning the texts before he began learning the rituals. Thousands of verses in archaic Avestan, learned by sound before they were learned by meaning, the meaning coming gradually through exegetical instruction in the Pahlavi language, the Middle Persian in which the later commentary tradition operated. The body had to know the texts before the mind could begin interpreting them. This is not how modern education works, and it is not how most people intuitively think learning should work. But it produced something the modern approach does not, a form of knowledge that lived below the threshold of consciousness, that was available in states of ritual performance when ordinary cognition was suspended or altered. Then came the rituals themselves. The yasna ceremony I mentioned earlier was not the only ritual in the Magi's repertoire, though it was central. The Visparad added additional liturgical sections to the yasna on particular sacred days. The Vendidad, the law against demons, was a text of purity regulations, descriptions of demonic entities and their methods of attack, prescriptions for the purification procedures that could cleanse contamination of various kinds. The Sirosa was a litany of the 30 days of the month, each sacred to a different divine entity. The Afrinagan was a blessing ceremony. The Baj, a grace formula spoken before and after meals. The liturgical calendar was dense and complex, with different ceremonies required on different days, different festivals marking different cosmological events throughout the year. The 6 great festivals, the Gahambars, mark the 6 stages of creation, the completion of sky, water, earth, plants, animals, and humans. To attend the Gahambar was to participate in the celebration of creation itself, to affirm that what Ahura Mazda had made was good, to strengthen by ritual affirmation the bonds between the created order and its divine sustaining principle. These were not occasions for asceticism or severity. They were feasts, shared meals, occasions for the community to gather and eat together and speak the liturgical words that connected the meal to its cosmic meaning. The Nowruz, the New Year, now still celebrated across Iran and Central Asia and by diaspora communities worldwide, marked the spring equinox, the moment when light and darkness were exactly balanced, and then light began to win. It remains, millennia after its origin, one of the most widely celebrated seasonal festivals on Earth. though most of its celebrants today have only a general sense of why it feels as significant as it does, why the 7 items arranged on the ceremonial table, and the moment of the equinox and the jumping over fire carry such weight. The answer is that they are carrying the weight of a cosmological story in which the annual return of the sun after winter is not just a natural event, but a victory, a confirmation that Ahura Mazda's order persists despite everything. The Magi were the professionals, the specialists, the ones who knew the full technical vocabulary of the system. But the system was designed, and this is a design choice, not an inevitability, to involve everyone. The layperson who maintained the domestic fire, who attended the Gahamba feasts, who spoke the basic prayers at the transitions of day and night, was not a passive recipient of priestly ritual. They were a participant. This is unusual for ancient religions. It is one of the reasons Zoroastrianism has had the influence it has had. The hero enters the story, not with a proclamation, but with silence. His name was Fereydun, and he was born during a time that the mythological tradition describes as among the worst the world had known, a time when the serpent king Zahhak, that same Zahhak who appears in the creation accounts as an enemy of the sacred fire, ruled from his throne in Babylon over a world bent and diminished under his power. The serpents that grew from Zahhak's shoulders were fed daily with human brains, and the 2 young men sacrificed each day to provide them were chosen from among the population by Zahhak's agents. And this had been happening for so long, 1,000 years, some versions say, that the population had largely ceased to protest. Evil had become administrative. Evil had become the ordinary shape of things. Fereydun's father, Abtin, was killed by Zahhak's agents before the child was born, and his mother hid him with a miraculous cow, the divine Barmaya, her coat dappled like a field of flowers, who nursed the infant in secret while his mother fled. The cow, the nourisher, the sacred female animal associated with the divine order, the creature whose type had been the primal bull of the creation. She kept the hero alive through the danger of his infancy, and when Zahhak's agents finally found her, Fereydun had grown strong enough to be moved to the mountain Albos, where he was raised by a sage, where he trained, where he waited. He waited without knowing exactly what he was waiting for. This is the way heroic formation always works in the Iranian mythological tradition. The hero is prepared without being given a schedule. The skills accumulate, the knowledge deepens, the body grows capable, and then the moment arrives, and the preparation is suddenly revealed as purposeful. The moment came when the blacksmith Kaveh, a man from the people, not from the aristocracy, not from the priesthood, tore his leather apron from the wall of the tyrant's court and walked out carrying it as a banner, and the people who saw him leave began to follow. Kaveh had lost sons to Zahhak's serpent feedings. He had lost enough. The apron became the Derafsh Kaviani, the legendary banner of Iranian kingship, a piece of leather that was subsequently decorated by each new Persian king with gems and gold until it became something almost unrecognizable as the working garment it had started as, and whose mythological significance lasted as long as there were Persian kings to carry it. Kaveh led his growing band of followers to Albors, to Fereydun. The hero came down from the mountain bearing a mace in the shape of a cow's head, the weapon associated with the divine order, the weapon whose form honored the creature that had saved him. He came down with two older brothers who serve, in the narrative, primarily as obstacles and cautionary tales. They were jealous of him from the beginning, and jealousy between brothers in this mythological tradition is never merely a personal failing, but a cosmic echo of the original division between order and chaos. Fereydun crossed the water that divided him from Zahhak's territory. Some versions specify the Tigris, some an unnamed cosmic river, and his crossing was contested by a ferryman who refused him, and then by divine beings who tested his worthiness, and then by Zahhak's fortress itself, whose defenses shuddered when Fereydun's foot touched the soil. The battle was not a battle in the conventional sense. Zahhak was not a human warrior who could be outfought in the field. He was a creature of concentrated demonic power, a corrupted form that had once been human and had made successive bargains with Angra Mainyu until he was more demon than man. The serpents on his shoulders, his visible inheritance of that corruption. Fereydun struck him with the cowhead mace. The blow was devastating, but it did not kill. And then, at the moment when Fereydun raised the mace again, a divine messenger appeared, a Yazata, a holy being, and instructed him to stop, not to kill, to bind. Zahhak was chained in a cave within the mountain Damavand, the great volcanic peak that still looms over Tehran, still dusted with snow through the summer, still visible from the city on clear days. He was bound there because he could not be killed. His death, the text suggests, would release the evil inside him into the world in a way too dangerous to contemplate, and bound there to wait until the end of time, when the final battle would be fought, and a hero yet unborn would finish what Fereydun began. The mountains still shake sometimes. People still tell each other, quietly, that it is Zahhak straining at his chains. The sacred fires burned more steadily after Fereydun took the throne. It is a small detail in the broader mythological record, but it is there. The state of the fire was the state of the world, and when a righteous king ruled, the fires were bright. The second hero came later, in a different mode. Her name was Anahita, and the question of whether she is a hero in the conventional sense is a question worth sitting with rather than answering too quickly. She was a Yazata, a holy being worthy of worship, rather than a human, but her mythology operates on the same heroic arc, and the Aban Yasht, the hymn dedicated to her in the Avesta, is one of the most formally beautiful texts in the entire Zoroastrian corpus, a long praise poem that describes her attributes and her history, and the great kings and heroes who invoked her. Anahita was the goddess of water. She was specifically the divine force behind the cosmic river Aredvi Sura, whose waters descended from the peak of Hara Berezaiti, the world mountain, and flowed outward to give life to all the rivers of the world. She was described as tall, strong, beautiful, wearing a crown of 8 rays, a garment of beaver fur, the beaver being a creature of the water and thus sacred to her, carrying a bearsman in her hand like a priest. She was simultaneously a warrior and a nurturer, simultaneously the force that made the fields fertile and the force that could be invoked before battle. The Achaemenid kings listed her alongside Ahura Mazda and Mithra in their great rock inscriptions at Persepolis and Nakshi-Rostam. And this triad, the Wise Lord, the Cosmic Waters, the Lord of Contracts, seems to have functioned as something like the practical divine government of the world in the royal religious imagination. Anahita's connection to fire is not obvious until you look at it from the right angle, and then it becomes inevitable. Water and fire are, in most symbolic systems, opposites. They cancel each other, compete for the same physical space, represent incompatible principles. But in the Zoroastrian cosmology, they are both sacred because they are both creations of Ahura Mazda, both targets of Angra Mainyu's corruption, both entities that require maintenance and protection. Anahita's waters, flowing pure and clean from the cosmic mountain, were the waters used in the Yasna ceremony. The ritual waters mixed with the Hauma offering, the waters that were themselves a divine presence at the sacred fire side. There is a temple tradition associated with Anahita specifically, a tradition of temple fires maintained in her honor, of fire and water kept in proximity rather than opposition, of the two sacred substances understood as complementary aspects of the divine order rather than conflicting elements. Strabo describes temples of Anahita in Armenia, where fires burned continuously and where the priests and priestesses who tended them lived under specific purity regulations dedicated entirely to this service. Whether these were technically Zoroastrian institutions or syncretic blends of older Iranian water goddess cults with the Zoroastrian fire tradition, the underlying principle was the same. The sacred required tending, and the tending required dedication. The kings came to Anahita for legitimacy. The Aban Yasht list them, generation after generation. Haoxiangha the Paradata, Yima the Splendid, Thraitaona, that same Fereydun, Keresaspa the hero who killed the great dragon Sruva, Vishtaspa who was Zoroaster's royal patron and who accepted the faith and gave it the political protection it needed to spread. Each of these kings came before the goddess of the waters and asked for her support, and each received it for a time. And what happened to those who lost it is a dark list of disasters, which is the Avesta's way of saying that divine legitimacy was not a permanent possession, but a relationship that required maintenance, the same way the fire did. The third hero of this age was Keresaspa, and I want to be honest with you. Keresaspa is the figure I have found myself spending the most time with, in the material, the one I keep returning to, the one whose story does something to me that I cannot quite. It is hard to describe what makes one mythological figure stick and another slip away, and I am not sure it is always a quality of the figure rather than a quality of whoever is looking. But Keresaspa matters for reasons beyond whatever attachment I have formed. He was the dragon killer before Fereydun was the serpent binder, operating in the mythological sequence that placed the great heroes of the Age of Heroes in a line of struggle against the monstrous, each one dealing with a different aspect of the demonic assault on creation. Keresaspa was the warrior hero, the physical champion, the one who went into battle, not because he was seeking glory, but because there were things in the world that needed to be fought, and there was no one else at hand who was capable of fighting them. His greatest enemy was Gandharva, the sea monster, the creature that lived in the cosmic ocean and periodically emerged to swallow down whatever was nearest. Gandharva was not a simple monster. The The tradition is specific that he was the mightiest of all the demonic creatures of the body, the most purely physical threat the world faced, the one whose defeat required not cleverness or divine favor, but force, sustained and unflinching force, applied over a long struggle. Keresaspa fought him in the cosmic ocean and overcame him and bound him, and the Avesta is specific that this binding was not permanent, that Gandharva would rise again, that the binding required periodic renewal. But the story I want to tell you about Keresaspa has nothing to do with Gandharva. There was a night somewhere in the hero's long campaigns when Keresaspa made camp by a fire. He built the fire on what appeared to be a flat rock, a natural platform suitable for the purpose, and he cooked his meal over it and then fell asleep beside its warmth. The flat rock was not a rock. It was Shruva, the horned dragon, whose hide was so thick and whose scales were so dense that they had fooled the hero. And when the fire's heat penetrated through those scales, and Shruva woke in pain and shook himself and threw the cooking pots across the landscape and scattered the fire and sent Keresaspa rolling through the grass, the hero, and this is the part that matters, was humiliated. Not hurt, but humiliated. He had failed to recognize what he was dealing with. The story is told in the tradition not as a defeat, but as a lesson. And the lesson is about the nature of the sacred fire. You must know what you are dealing with before you build a fire on it. You must understand the ground. You must be certain that what you are treating as ordinary, as mere flat rock, as mere camping surface, is in fact what it appears to be. The fire does not care about your assumptions. The fire reveals truth. Keresaspa killed Shruva eventually. He came back and he killed it. But he remembered the humiliation, and the remembering made him a different kind of warrior, one who took a moment after that to know what he was fighting before he fought it. He is also the hero who will, in the Zoroastrian eschatological tradition, be resurrected at the end of time to kill Zahhak, when Zahhak finally breaks free of his mountain chains. He is sleeping now, in a specific tradition, sleeping in a specific cave, maintained by a divine guardian who keeps him in a state between life and death, waiting for the crisis that will require him. The fire that Fereydun bound will require the force that Keresaspa provides. The chain of heroism stretches across all of time in both directions. The fourth great figure of this period is one who never appears in most Western accounts of Persian mythology, and whose absence from those accounts is instructive. Her name was Hutausa, and she was the wife of Vishtaspa, the king who was Zoroaster's royal patron. In some traditions, she is described as having initially resisted the conversion of the court to the Zoroastrian faith, having used her influence as queen to obstruct Zoroaster's access to the king. In others, she is the one who ultimately persuaded Vishtaspa, who spoke the arguments that tilted the royal decision, whose conversion preceded and enabled her husband's. The two versions exist in genuine tension in the texts, and rather than choosing between them, I think it is worth holding both, because together they describe something true about how religious change actually works at the level of courts and dynasties. It is rarely a matter of a single dramatic conversion, but a process of negotiation and resistance and eventual capitulation that leaves traces in the record without ever resolving into a clean narrative What Hutaosa represents in the larger symbolic structure is the household, the interior of the social order, the domain that the Atash Dadga, the domestic fire, served and symbolized. The king could accept or reject Zoroaster's teaching at the political level, could make it the official religion of the court, could send his armies to spread it. But without the domestic sphere, without the women who maintained the hearth fires, who performed the daily rituals of purity, who ensured that the next generation was raised within the faith, the institutional structure had no ground to stand on. The Magi knew this. The purity system, the ritual calendar, the domestic fire practices, these were structured to survive political upheaval, to be maintained in private homes even when the political structure of the broader society was hostile or indifferent or simply collapsed. When Alexander came and burned Persepolis in 330 BCE and the Achaemenid Empire ended, the Magi continued. When the Seleucid Greeks replaced Persian rule with a Hellenizing administration that treated Zoroastrian practice as an interesting foreign curiosity rather than the operating cosmological framework of the universe, the Magi continued. When the Parthians came, and the Sassanids came, and the Arabs came, and the Mongols came, each time the fire continued. Not everywhere, not without loss, but enough. Hutaosa is the symbol of that continuity. She is the one who kept the household fire burning when the political winds shifted, who ensured the thread was not cut, who understood that the flame on the domestic altar was as sacred as the flame in the great temple, and that losing one was losing the world's connection to Asha as surely as losing the other. Anyway, there is a period in the history of the Magi that I want to get through quickly because it is heavily debated, and I do not want to get lost in the scholarship when what matters for our purposes is the outline. Between the fall of the Achaemenid dynasty and the rise of the Sassanids, roughly 5 centuries from Alexander's conquest to the 3rd century CE, the Zoroastrian religious establishment was in a state of significant disruption and transformation. The Parthians, who were Iranian-speaking but not particularly devout Zoroastrians in the formal sense, tolerated a wide variety of religious practices in their empire, including a dramatic syncretism between the Iranian divine beings and the Greek gods, Anahita becoming identified with Aphrodite, Mithra with Apollo and Helios, Ahura Mazda with Zeus. The Magi continued to function, but their institutional centrality was reduced. During this same period, Mithraism emerged as a mystery cult, spreading with extraordinary speed through the Roman Empire along military and trade routes, becoming at one point a serious competitor to Christianity for the religious loyalty of the Roman world. The cult of Mithra, which the Romans called Mithras, and which the scholars still debate how closely it resembled the original Iranian Mithra, involved initiatory grades, communal meals, elaborate ritual symbolism centered on a bull-killing scene whose iconographic meaning has been argued about for a century without resolution. It also involved fire. The Mithraic caves where the ceremonies were held featured altars and torches and a particular orientation toward the sun. Whether Mithraism was a direct export of Magian practice or a creative Roman appropriation of Iranian symbols, it was clearly drawing on the same fundamental structure: fire as the visible presence of divine order, ritual as the human participation in cosmic maintenance. The Sassanid revival, the dynasty that ruled Persia from 224 to 651 CE, and that made Zoroastrianism the official state religion with an institutional force it had never previously possessed, produced both a flowering and a crystallization. The Avesta was committed to writing, or rather, a version of it was. Much had already been lost, and the texts we have are the Sassanid reconstruction of what could be recovered, which is why the Avesta that exists today is a fragment of what the tradition says once existed. The priesthood was organized hierarchically with explicit grades and responsibilities. The fire temples were standardized, the Atash Bahrams given state support, the great fires of specific regions given names and histories, and symbolic significance that connected them to the whole imperial structure. 3 great fires burned during the Sassanid period with particular importance. Adur-Gushnasp, the fire of warriors and kings, burned at a site in Azerbaijan that has been tentatively identified with the ruins at Takht-i-Soleiman. Adur-Farnbag, the fire of priests, burned in Persis, the homeland of the Persian dynasty. Adur-Burzin-Mir, the fire of farmers and herdsmen, burned in Nishapur. Together, the 3 fires represented the 3 estates of Sassanid society: royalty and warriors, priests, and the agricultural populace who sustained the whole structure. When a Sassanid king was crowned, he went to the fire of his estate. When he went to war, the fire was invoked. The fire was not just symbolically connected to the state. The state was, in some structural sense, organized around the fire. The Arab conquest in the 7th century ended this. The fire of Adur-Gushnasp, the most symbolically significant of the 3, the one associated with royal legitimacy, was reportedly extinguished during or immediately after the conquest, though the exact date and circumstances are disputed. The Magi who could leave, left. Some went east into Central Asia, where Zoroastrian communities survived for centuries longer. Some went west into Byzantine territory, and some, most significantly for the preservation of the living tradition, went by sea to the western coast of India, to Gujarat, and later to the region around Mumbai, where they became the Parsis, Persians, and where their descendants maintain 3 of the surviving Atash Bahrams today. I need to pause here. We have been moving through an enormous span of time, and I want to make sure that the shape of the fire tradition is still visible through all of the historical detail, because the historical detail is not the point. The historical detail is the water. The fire is the point. The fire tradition that the Magi carried was, at its core, a claim about the relationship between human action and cosmic order. The claim was this: what you do matters beyond the scale of its visible effects. When you tend the fire correctly, you are not just maintaining a flame. You are affirming Asha, the principle of rightness, in a universe that is actively contested by the principle of wrongness. Your daily ritual is a small act in an ongoing battle, but the battle is real, and every act counts. This claim has a twin in nearly every subsequent religious tradition that the Magi touched. The Jewish concept of tikkun olam, the repair of the world, has a family resemblance to it that some scholars think is historical and others think is structural. The Christian theology of sanctification, the idea that human action participates in the divine work of transforming the world, borrows from the same well, though the well's label has been changed. The Islamic concept of Khalifa, of humans as vicegerents or stewards of creation with a responsibility to maintain it, echoes the same structure. These are not coincidences. The ancient world of the Near East was a space of intense religious exchange, and the Magi, as priests who operated at the courts of empires, who interpreted dreams for Babylonian kings and Persian kings, and who appear as far afield as Matthew's Gospel, were among the most mobile and most influential transmitters of religious ideas that the ancient world produced. The specific practice of sacred fire is harder to trace in its influence because fire is universal enough that parallel development is always possible. But the specific theology of fire as a divine entity requiring tending, fire as the visible form of cosmic truth, fire as the meeting point between the human and the divine. This specific complex of ideas does not emerge independently in every culture that has a hearth. It has a genealogy, and that genealogy runs through the plateau of ancient Iran, through the Magi who tended the flames, through the long centuries of a tradition that took the extraordinary seriously in both directions, extraordinary in its demands on the practitioner, and extraordinary in its claims about what the practice meant. The eschatology is where the story becomes, in a way I find difficult to describe without either overstating or understating, genuinely vertiginous. The Zoroastrian account of the end of time is not an end in the sense of a conclusion. It is a completion. Fraishekere, the term translated variously as renovation or making wonderful or the final rehabilitation, is the event toward which the entire cosmic drama has been oriented from the beginning. It is the moment when the wound that Angra Mainyu inflicted on creation is finally healed, when Druj is finally and permanently defeated, when the mixed, complicated, frustrating world in which we live is restored to the purity and luminosity of the first creation. The sequence of events leading to Fraishekere involves a series of Saoshyants, saviors, literally ones who bring benefit, who will be born in each age to gradually tip the balance further toward Asha. The third and final Saoshyant will be born of a virgin impregnated by the preserved seed of Zoroaster himself, kept in a lake and guarded by divine beings for thousands of years. He will raise the dead. He will preside over the final judgment in which every soul is purified, including, ultimately, the souls of the damned, who will pass through a river of molten metal that to the righteous will feel like warm milk, and to the wicked will feel exactly like what it is, and who will emerge from that trial refined and clean and ready for the renovated world. The fire at the end of time will be universal. There will be no darkness because there will be nothing left that needs to hide in it. Keresaspa will wake from his sleep and kill Zahhak. Zahhak's chains will have failed, or Zahhak will have broken them. The texts vary on this point, and the monster will rampage briefly across a world that is already in the final stages of Fraishekere before the hero rises and delivers the blow that was deferred at the mountain and completes what Fereydun began. The three great sinners, most prominent in the mythological record, Zahhak, Afrasiab, the Turanian king, who committed fratricide and threatened the Iranian lands for generations, and a third whose name varies by tradition, will be finally, permanently destroyed, and the fire that has burned continuously in the temples, the fire that the Magi have tended through empires and conquests and displacements, the fire that the Parsi priests in India still tend with cloths over their faces to prevent contamination by breath. That fire is connected to this eschatological fire not symbolically, but actually. Every act of tending the flame is a participation in the process that leads toward Fraishekere. Every morning prayer spoken at the domestic hearth, every log added to the Atash Behram with proper ritual care, every yasna ceremony performed by a priest who has spent years memorizing texts in a dead language. These are all contributions to the ongoing project of restoring a broken world. There is something almost, and here is where I have to be careful, where I am aware of a modern sensibility trying to surface and of pulling it back. There is something that contemporary people might be tempted to read as ecological about this structure. The world as a sacred trust that requires maintenance. The human being as a participant in the world's preservation rather than simply a user of it. The understanding that daily acts have cosmic consequences, that what happens at the scale of the household fire reverberates outward to the scale of the cosmic fire. I'm not saying Zoroastrianism anticipated environmentalism. That would be anachronistic in a way that respects neither the tradition nor the contemporary movement. But I am saying that the structural concerns are not entirely unrelated, and that people who encounter this tradition often feel something that they recognize. The ancient Magi, looking at the flame they had just spent hours consecrating, looking at the fire that represented Asha, made visible, looking at the light that pushed the darkness back. They were not looking at the same thing we are when we look at a fire, but they were not looking at something completely other either. The nature of Magian ritual knowledge is worth examining from the inside, or as close to the inside as we can get across this distance. The problem with describing any esoteric ritual practice is that description is fundamentally from the outside. To describe a ceremony is to flatten it, to reduce it to its visible components, to lose the interior dimension that is arguably the only part that matters to the practitioner. The Zoroastrian tradition is not alone in this. The same problem applies to describing a Christian Mass to someone who has never participated in one, or a Zen meditation retreat to someone who has only read about sitting still. The description is not wrong. It is just incomplete in a specific way. What we can say about the interior dimension of Magian fire ritual, drawing on the texts and on the testimony of practitioners recorded at various points in the tradition, is something like this. The fire was not something you watched. It was something you were in relationship with. The long preparation, the memorized text, the purity regulations, the correct handling of the bearsman and the haoma and the sacred water. All of this was not preparation for an encounter with the fire. All of this was itself the encounter. The ritual form was not a container for a spiritual experience that happened somewhere inside it. The ritual form was the spiritual experience. This is a strange thing to say in a contemporary context where we tend to divide form and content, where we assume the ritual is the vehicle and the spiritual experience is the destination. The Zoroastrian ritual tradition suggests that this division is an error. The content is the form. The sacred presence that the yasna ceremony addresses and maintains and participates in is not something that the ceremony points at from a distance. It is present in the ceremony, in the specific spoken words, in the specific gestures, in the relationship between the fire and the priest who tends it, and the community whose welfare the ceremony serves. The Magi carried this understanding through centuries of political disruption, precisely because it is the kind of knowledge that does not require institutional support to survive. You cannot burn a building and destroy this knowledge. You can kill the priests, and the tradition has lost many priests over its history to violence and displacement. But the tradition responds to this not with a desperate clutching at texts and records, though records matter and texts are preserved, but with the understanding that the knowledge lives in the practice, and the practice lives in the living community that maintains it. The Parsi communities in India have maintained the Atash Behrams for over 1,000 years in a foreign land, in a culture that was not their own, against considerable odds. They have done this not because they have a building in which a flame burns. They have done this because they are a community that knows how to maintain a flame, that has within it the knowledge of what the flame requires and what the tending of it means, that has passed this knowledge down through generations, not primarily through texts, but through practice, through doing, through the act of going to the temple and being present and maintaining the relationship. The flame is the relationship. The relationship is the flame. What survives is not what we expect to survive. The Achaemenid Empire built the largest political structure the ancient world had yet seen. It administered 30 satrapies from Sardis to Bactria, from Egypt to India, with a postal system and road network and bureaucratic apparatus that the Greeks found simultaneously admirable and alarming. It is mostly gone. The roads are ruins. The palaces at Persepolis are ruins. The administrative records, the ones that survived, are in museums in Persepolis and Tehran and the Oriental Institute in Chicago, fragmentary and decontextualized. The fire is still burning in Udvada, in Gujarat, in Mumbai, in Navsari. 3 fires maintained by the descendants of refugees in a country that was not their own, in a tradition that has been a minority for 14 centuries, facing significant demographic challenges and internal theological debates about conversion policy and the definition of community membership that will determine whether the tradition survives another century. These are real problems. The Parsi community is small and growing smaller, and the debates about how to respond to this are genuine and unresolved and not my place to adjudicate. But the fires are still burning today. There is something difficult to articulate about this. I'm going to try anyway, knowing I am probably going to miss it slightly. The continuity of the flame, not as metaphor, as actual physical flame, as the specific fire that was consecrated through specific ritual procedures and has been maintained in continuous operation across a span of time that outlasts most of the political entities that seemed more durable, is a form of evidence about something. I am not sure exactly what it is evidence of, which is different from saying it is not evidence. It suggests that the ritual tradition underestimated the durability of the thing it was meant to protect. Or it suggests that the thing it was meant to protect is more durable than the empires and armies that try to destroy it. Or it suggests that the daily act of tending, of coming back and coming back again, and not letting the flame go out even when the political conditions make it difficult or dangerous, is itself a kind of power. The Magi said the fire was a divine being that required relationship. They said the tending of it was a participation in the cosmic work of maintaining order against chaos. They said the daily ritual was not mere ceremony, but a genuine contribution to the ongoing project of Asha, of rightness, of things being as they should be. The fire has outlasted everything that has tried to extinguish it. This does not prove the theology. Nothing proves the theology. But it is interesting. The word magic comes from these priests. I said this at the beginning, and I want to return to it now, at the end, because the direction of the transmission is worth following in its detail. The Greek word magos, borrowed from Old Persian magos, entered Latin as magos, plural magi. In Latin, it gradually acquired the connotation of one who practices secret arts, and from that connotation, it produced magia, magic, the art of the magi. By the time this word reached the medieval European tradition, the original referent, a specific priestly caste of ancient Iran, had been almost entirely forgotten, and what remained was a cluster of associations: secrecy, power over natural forces, the ability to work effects in the world through procedures that ordinary people could not perform, which is not entirely wrong. It is just that the secrecy in the original case was not mystification for its own sake, but the protection of technical knowledge that took years to acquire and that required proper formation to use correctly. The power over natural forces was not manipulation, but participation in the divine order that structured those forces. The ability to work effects in the world through procedures was precisely what the yasna ceremony claimed to do, what every tending of the sacred fire claimed to do, not to bend reality to human will, but to align human action with the divine will that maintained reality against the assault of chaos. The distortion is enormous and in some ways complete, and yet the word that in English and most European languages refers to the entire category of supernatural human power came from these priests. The root of the idea, however obscured, however transformed, is an old Iranian priest standing before a fire he has tended for decades, speaking words in a dead language, maintaining a relationship with a divine presence that his community could not afford to let go cold. That priest is not here. The empire he served is gone. The political structures that supported his institution are dust. But the word he gave to the world is still in the mouths of people who do not know where it comes from, and the fire is still burning in Udvada. The ancient teaching about fire was ultimately a teaching about attention, not attention in the weak sense, not merely noticing, not merely being present in the vague modern way the word sometimes carries. Attention in the strong sense, the sustained, disciplined, costly act of returning, again and again, to the thing that matters. The fire did not tend itself. It required someone to come back tomorrow, to come back in the rain, to come back when the empire was falling and the political situation was desperate and there were many other urgent demands on one's time, to come back because the fire was a relationship, and relationships do not persist through neglect. The teaching was also about what happens when attention is sustained over time. The fire that had been tended for decades was not the same as a fire that had just been lit. The Atash Behram that had been maintained through the proper ritual process over a year of consecration was not the same as a bonfire. The priest who had spent 30 years performing the yasna was not doing the same thing as a novice speaking the same words. Attention accumulates, relationship deepens. The fire knows the priest who has spent a life with it in a way that defies the categories we usually use for this kind of statement. And the priest knows the fire in the same way. This is, I think, why the tradition survived. Not because the theology was compelling, though it was compelling. Not because the institution was strong, though the institution was sometimes strong, but because the practice itself generated, in the people who sustained it, a form of knowledge and relationship that they were not willing to lose. The fire was worth keeping not because someone told them so, but because keeping it had shown them something that could not be shown any other way. The Magi understood this at the beginning. It is, perhaps, the most important thing they understood. The great fires of the ancient world, Adur Gushnasp on the mountain above the lake in Azerbaijan, Adur Farnbag in the priest's homeland, Adur Buzin Mir in the farming country of Nishapur. These are mostly gone now. The temples are ruins. The priests who tended them are centuries dead. But the knowledge of how to tend a fire, the understanding of what it means to maintain a relationship with something sacred and fragile and requiring constant return, this is not gone. It is in Utvada. It is in the hands and the memories of the priests who still perform the yasna in archaic Avestan that has not been a spoken language for millennia. It is in the community that has kept the flame through everything that has tried to put it out. And it is, in some sense, that I hesitate to specify but do not want to leave unacknowledged in the act of attention itself. In any act of sustained, costly, returning attention to something that matters. The form the ancient Magi used is specific and beautiful, and not everyone's to use. But the underlying truth that the form expressed is available to anyone who has ever come back to something that required coming back to, who has understood in their body that the fire does not tend itself, who has felt the specific quality of knowledge that only appears after you have maintained a relationship long enough for it to teach you something you could not have been told. That is the oldest thing the priests of ancient Iran knew. That is the thing they built their entire cosmological architecture on top of. The fire requires tending. The tending is the relationship. The relationship is the sacred. Go slowly towards sleep now. Let the warmth of whatever fire you have near you, literal or metaphorical, in a fireplace or a lamp, or the particular quality of light on a familiar ceiling. Let it be enough for tonight. The world is being maintained out there, one small returned attention at a time, in ways you cannot see from where you are lying. It has been being maintained this way for a very long time. The flame has been kept. Good night.